Hello, good morning. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 5th Annual Denver Marijuana Management Symposium. My name is Ashley Kilroy, and I'm the Executive Director of the Department of Excise and Licenses. We also have the Office of Marijuana Policy housed in Excise and Licenses. We are charged with overseeing everything related to marijuana regulation, education, and enforcement in the City of County of Denver. And we work closely with our sister agencies to do this. We don't do this alone just through the licensing department. We work closely with our Denver Public Health Department. We work closely with our Denver Community Planning and Development Department. We work closely with Denver Police and closely with Denver Fire. We could not do what we do without that collaborative model that we use. And you're going to hear from a lot of them today. They'll be here and be able to answer a lot of questions and lead a couple of the panels. So thank you for being here today. Welcome to Denver. Welcome to the Mile High City. I'm sorry it's raining. I'm very disappointed about that. We usually have great sunshine. I think I checked my phone, it's going to get sunny in the next hour or two, and then be sunny for the next couple of days. So I hope you enjoy Denver and get out. And I know the Great American Beer Festival is this weekend, so maybe you can enjoy that too. Last night I took a quick look at the list of attendees, and a lot of you have traveled really far. A lot of you are local. But we have 17 different states represented at this conference. We have people from as far away as Alaska and as far away as Hawaii here. We also have about 5 different countries represented. As I looked at the attendee list, we have representatives from Australia, who the mayor and I met with yesterday. We have representatives from Canada. We have some representatives from Mexico, Guam, and we had someone from the Netherlands as well. So thank you for being here. Really, it's a great opportunity for everyone to get to know each other. We're excited to see, familiar faces and the new faces. Before I go any further, can anybody who is new, if this is your first time at the symposium, could you please raise your hand? Wow, that's a lot of new people. Great, welcome. And can you raise your hand if you are just 1 year into legalization or if you're looking to legalize next year? So sort of brand new. Yes, well, welcome to you. This is a unique conference. It's a regulator-to-regulator conference. We believe that as regulators, we're uniquely situated to really learn from one another and to brainstorm and kind of figure out where all we are and have some really good, candid conversations. Whether you're from a county government, city, state, foreign country, whether you're in one of those different agencies, we're all here to learn together and help. You'll be able to learn from the experts, from the panelists who have great experience, people who can help you do your job better. And then also, hopefully, you'll have a lot of peer one-on-one conversations where you can share your experiences and get to know people. As many of you probably know, this industry is evolving quickly and constantly innovating. And even though in Denver we've been doing this for 6 years, and even though many of you are returning here, we still all have a lot to learn. There are new products that we see almost every day, right? New processes, new procedures, new ways that they're doing things. A lot of us are implementing new programs, whether it's social equity programs, marijuana delivery, marijuana clubs. So there's a lot going on. We need to constantly be learning. If you think about this, our marijuana licensees, by nature, by definition, right, they're risk takers and they're entrepreneurs. And because they're constantly learning and innovating, we need to continue to learn, continue to innovate so that we can help make them safe as they process their products and as they sell their products, keep our consumers safe and keep our communities safe. So you're sitting here today because you're a regulator for the most part. We definitely have some industry people and some ancillary businesses and some community people. But for the most part, we have regulators here. And you're sitting here because it is your job to implement this. Regardless of whether you are in favor of it or not, it is your job, and it goes to the foundation of what we do as regulators. And if you think of it, if you think about it, a lot of us go into government and we start with a program that's already been established and we're just continuing to move it along. We are in a privileged position, really, to start a new program from the ground up, and we have an obligation to get it right. And it is, at this point, at the launch of any new program, where you're going to have a high level of focus on you. And we're going to all make mistakes, and we all do. But you want to make sure you're doing the best you can, because if that narrative gets away from you and you don't have the public support, or public thinks that this isn't working well, not only can they lose faith in what you're doing, but in government overall. So that's what we're here today. We're going to give you the tools. We're going to all do this together, and we're going to get through it and do a great job. One of the things I think important, too, is to be sure to stay and hang out for the reception tonight from 5 to 6. Get to know your colleagues. Get to know your colleagues at the table, because our Denver collaborative model does not stop at our borders. And as I look around here, seeing a number of our close partners, number of jurisdictions, we talk to different jurisdictions all the time. I mean, I think when I talk about our collaborative model and all the agencies that work with us, probably somebody from Denver is speaking to somebody from another jurisdiction every day, if not, a couple of times a week. So it's so important that we stay connected and share this information. So focusing down on Denver, focusing on where we are, we legalized medical marijuana. Our voters voted in favor of it in 2000. So almost 20 years. Then our voters voted in favor of recreational marijuana in November of 2012, and we launched retail sales on January 1st, 2014, the first in the world to have retail sales. Now, flash forward to 2019, and we have over 1,000 marijuana licenses operating out of about 500 unique locations, and it looks like our sales tax next year will be about $63 million. But it wasn't easy to get here. It absolutely wasn't. We didn't know what we didn't know, but we knew we had a lot of work ahead of us to implement the will of the voters, and we didn't have anyone to turn to. We had no other city really to turn to. But we had the vision of an extraordinary leader. We had our mayor who had a plan for us, who had a blueprint for us, who showed us a path forward. Our mayor is the one who came up with this model that we use, and we still use today, the Denver Collaborative Model. And it's because of his leadership we are here today. As we look ahead to the next era of marijuana legalization, there is no one better to talk to you today about where we've gone and where we're going than our mayor, Mayor Michael B. Hancock. Mayor Hancock is in his third term with the city. He has led us out of a recession into unprecedented prosperity and growth, all while overseeing marijuana and a whole host of other things. So please welcome to the table Mayor Michael B. Hancock.
Thank you all very much, and welcome to Denver, Colorado. I want to welcome you to the Denver Marijuana Management Symposium. We appreciate you taking the time to be in the Mile High City today to talk about this very important issue that is emerging across this nation and actually has become a global issue. And so I'm glad you're here to be a part of this discussion this morning. Before I get started, I want to acknowledge and do a shout out for Ashley Kilroy and who is our Director of Excise and Licensing, but was our first marijuana policy director. And I remember the day when I called her into the office in 2014 and said, you've done well in the Department of Safety, but I think it's time for you to take your career to a whole new level. How about becoming our new marijuana policy czar director? And neither one of us knew what that meant, but the voters had just passed recreational marijuana in Denver. In Denver alone, it passed by 61% of the vote. And it was clear that the expectations were that we would opt in and we would implement this new model. Ashley took the bull by its horns and really ushered in what we would come to find out to be the first regulatory recreational marijuana policy in the world. And today, we are a model for the world. And so if you'll join me in just thanking Ashley Kilroy, the Department of Excise and Licensing, Molly Duplechian, and the rest of the players over there for the work that they've done. For those of you who from outside of Colorado, we welcome you to Colorado and, of course, to the Mile High City. Again, Ashley mentioned we welcomed the visitors from Australia yesterday, and we know that other countries are represented here and from throughout the country. We're glad you're here, and if you're from throughout Colorado, certainly we welcome you into the Mile High City as well. You know, before I jump into my brief remarks, I think it's important to kind of set the stage in terms of my evolution and where I come from with regards to this issue, because I think it underscores why I wanted to make sure there was a tight framework around our implementation around marijuana. Our best reference is the experiences that we've come from. As the youngest of 10 children, I can tell you we had the perfect number in our household. The perfect number meaning that when it comes to statistical analysis, you know that you have 2 of something, 3 of something, 5 of something, and it worked for my family. And unfortunately, we went through some very difficult experiences with having a couple of siblings who were addicted to drugs. And I watched, as the youngest of 10, how some of my older siblings started with marijuana and gradually progressed to some of the more challenging drugs that are in our market at that time, crack cocaine being one of them. And so I was colored. My perception was colored. My experiences were very clear that I believed marijuana was a gateway drug. And only over my dead body as a member of the city council and a newly elected mayor was I'm going to sit back and let marijuana become legalized in our state and certainly in our city. In fact, I don't know one elected official at the time in 2014 who endorsed the legalization of marijuana. I'm talking about throughout the state. Clearly remember a gaggle of elected officials standing up at a press conference saying this cannot happen in Colorado. And I was there. And we fought. And we marched, and we knocked on doors, and we did commercials, and we did the leaflets, our pictures, saying we cannot legalize marijuana. And people of Colorado resoundingly rejected our position. And so on that day when Ashley and I sat down, we had behind us my campaigning against legalization of marijuana, and in front of us, my oath to carry out the will of the people. It's a difficult situation, but one of the things you learn as an elected official is that it's not about you. And the moment it becomes about you, you no longer are fit to serve in public office. The people of Denver had spoken, and now it's my responsibility, my administration's responsibility to responsibly implement marijuana policy and the legalized industry in our city. I have made 3 in the 8 years now, 8.5 years that I've been mayor, 3 scheduled appearances before city council. Because as mayor of Denver, you don't meet as part of city council. This was the first time I would go before city council. And the point I wanted to make to them is we're going to implement it, we're going to tax it, we are going to regulate the hell out of it, and then we're going to build an enforcement structure around it. And we're also going to do everything we can to protect our children. And those would be the 4 guiding tenets and objectives of our policy. Ashley would be the leader of helping us to do that. And so here we are. If there's one important lesson we've learned in leading this industry, is that collaboration is the key. I have been amazed, and I was amazed, I should say, to watch the industry come to the table and say we want to play a role in helping to set up the regulatory framework. What was, of course, there was a distrustful environment at first. They knew how vehemently I was out fighting against it and how ready they were to go implement, and I was not trustful of them. Of course, you want to help set up the regulatory system that would oversee your implementation. But we would come to learn that these men and women, many of whom who had never used marijuana, had no plan to use marijuana, saw this as a business opportunity. And they didn't want this system to go bad any more than we did. And they rolled up their sleeves, and they helped develop this first regulatory system, and it has worked in Colorado. We set up a taxing system, we set up the regulation system, and we came to understand that we would use the resources initially without earmarking them, but initially to set up the enforcement, to beef up our enforcement around that regulatory framework. Over the next 2 days, we are looking forward to sharing the knowledge with you around our collaborative model with our fire department, police department, public health department, community planning and development, our Office of Marijuana Policy, all that came around the table, and all that we've learned over the years with regards to our legalized marijuana system. And of course, we also look forward to learning new ideas and approaches from other cities that are in this room facing similar challenges in Denver. One of the most valuable values that we went into the system believing is that we don't know what we don't know, and we are going to learn. I remember going to Amsterdam and saying, we're here to learn how you did this system. And he looked at us and said, really? We're here to learn how you're going to do the system, because we don't have a system. Our system is tolerance. And so we realized that what we were embarking on was truly unprecedented, not only in the United States, but around the world. Come January 1st, we will reach the 6th year anniversary of legalized marijuana sales in Denver, Colorado. And we couldn't be prouder of what we have accomplished through our collaborative management model. Government, industry, community, everyone had a seat at the table, because that is that unknown world that we were stepping into. But we had to make it work. Failure was not an option. So as the momentum continues to pick up and additional states across the U.S. choose to end marijuana prohibition, it's more important than ever for jurisdictions to share information about successful regulation, enforcement of rules, and educating the public. And one thing is clear: the landscape today is very different than it was 6 years ago. There's a lot more knowledge out there. In fact, it's different than it was just a year ago. Denver and other jurisdictions across the U.S. are entering the next era of legalized recreational marijuana, something we like to call here in Colorado as marijuana 2.0. Important issues such as social equity and social justice are moving to the forefront while we continue to focus on protecting the public health and public safety. And many communities, in particular the African American community and other communities of color, are waking up and realizing that this industry has become a billion-dollar industry that was also the same industry that was responsible for locking up hundreds of thousands of African Americans. The same laws that they went to jail for are now legal, and people are becoming multimillionaires. That's social justice and social equity. It's why cities and states around the nation have moved to expunge some of those laws that continue to stand in the way of these men and women gaining a better quality of life and access to opportunity, and ironically, entry into this very industry. Today and throughout this summit, we can learn from each other about how to safely manage the rapid change in laws allowing expanded marijuana consumption options at businesses and home delivery of marijuana. We can learn from each other about how those who have been affected by the war on drugs can now find opportunities in the legalized industry, and how these new revenues can be put to use, bringing social benefit to the community. And we can learn from each other about how our rules and laws can and should adapt to changing norms and changing society. In fact, it's also good to see just this past week, the House of Representatives passed the Safe Banking Act last week. Yes, you can clap. That's an important move. Very important move for this industry. And I wanted to give a celebration out to our very own Representative Ed Perlmutter for leading the charge, and we were proud to stand with him in support of that legislation. We hope the Senate does what's right and moves forward and make this legislation federal law in the coming days. With that, I know that our team here looks forward to updating you on all that we have done and all that we have going on. And we look forward again to learning what everyone else is working on and what new landscapes will be taking on in this industry over the next few years. Again, thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it, and we hope it works out in terms of new knowledge. Welcome, Denver, and let's get to work.
All right, thank you, Mayor Hancock. That was great. So next up, we have Judy Steele here to say a few words. Judy is the Director of Cannabis Regulation for Acela, and Acela is the licensing and permitting platform that we in Denver use to manage marijuana. Judy is the Director of Cannabis Regulation for Acela's Center of Expertise, a team of industry leaders with expertise in emerging and complex markets. In this role, Judy serves as marijuana regulation and technology expert, helping government leaders navigate complicated licensing and permitting challenges and prepare communities for whatever comes next. Ms. Steele has an extensive background in government and business relations, including business licensing with the City and County of Denver. Judy used to work with us in the Department of Excise and Licenses. She has a lot of experience in business formation filings, UCC filings, notary commissions in the state of Colorado's Secretary of State's office, where she worked to help transition all paper-based filing to an online web-based application process where customers are able to self-serve. Judy was a key player on Denver's marijuana management policy team and instrumental in implementing marijuana licensing in the City and County of Denver. In addition, Ms. Steele was also part of the team that implemented cannabis licensing for the state of California's Department of Food and Agriculture, as well as the Department of Consumer Affairs. Please welcome to the stage and to the podium, Judy Steele.
Wow, thank you so much, Ashley. So I just want to say it truly is a pleasure to be here on behalf of Acela to welcome each and every one of you to the Denver Marijuana Management Symposium. We're honored to be the symposium chair and provide support to regulators across the country and around the world so they can come together and share their insights with each other. Not to mention, Denver really is a beautiful city, and it's a great place to explore. I've had the privilege of attending this amazing event since the beginning, both as you heard, as a former regulator, and today as the director of Acela Center of Expertise. I'm always surprised to see just how this event grows each and every year. My role at Acela is to support those who are implementing cannabis and hemp automation to track licensing, inspections, complaints, and enforcement activities. Previously, I had the great honor of working under Mayor Hancock and working with Ashley Kilroy and many, many others as the Deputy Director of Excise and Licenses. And that, again, was when recreational was passed by the voters here in this great city. I had the opportunity to learn so much about the cannabis industry, often and quickly, all at once it felt like. I'd receive calls from jurisdictions inquiring about Denver's legalization regulations and licensing processes. People were curious, and they just wanted to know what we had done, what we had put into place, and how we had done that. So it took a great team of people. And I remember we would meet with people often. They were always coming to Denver looking for advice and just a little bit of guidance and direction. And this symposium really was born out of that. Ashley kind of took that by the reins, put this together, and provided the ability for regulators to share insights, lessons learned, and information with each other. And I'm so proud to be a part of that, and for our company, Acela, to be able to support that and support all of you in the hard work that you do each and every day. So today, there are many more individuals here continuing to share what they've learned from their own jurisdiction. Legalization has its similarities and differences in each and every jurisdiction. We have things that are the same, but each community is so unique and has its own challenges that it has to grow through. And so that brings on different regulations. We also have hemp legalization that was approved in the Farm Bill last year in December. And so that has created a change for all of you regulators too. I've heard stories for some around CBD and how the hemp market can overlay into the legalized market with CBDs, and the information that people are exploring to understand the medical benefits of it and how we can regulate it and make sure that it's safe. So I believe that this symposium will be beneficial to many of you, and I hope you find a couple of takeaways during your time here. Asala is excited to be a sponsor of this great event, and I would love to get to know you, so feel free to stop by our area and introduce yourself. Thank you so much, and enjoy the symposium.
Okay, great. Well, we're going to move right into our panel discussions. The first one is a national roundtable, and Deputy Director Molly Duplechian of Excise and Licenses is going to be leading it and introducing the panelists. So, Molly. So how about, why don't we have the panelists come on up and start getting situated, and we'll give Molly a few minutes. Okay. Come on up. Okay, come on up. And why don't you introduce yourself for us, please? Sure. You want to come to the podium? Yes, please.
Good morning. Thank you. My name is Eduardo Arnal. I am a federal congressman in Mexico, and I was a federal, Consul General of Mexico here in Denver for 4 years. Then I was posted in Chicago, and then in Salt Lake City. Right now, I have a consulting firm in Utah, and I have been specialized in the cannabis industry in the last 2 years. I'm based in Mexico City, but I come very frequently here to the Mile City. So thank you for being here today.
Good morning, everybody. I apologize. We were gathering out in the lobby for just a second, but so I missed the first couple of minutes. But good morning. My name is Molly Duplechian. I'll be moderating this panel. I am the Deputy Director of Policy for the Department of Excise and Licenses in the Office of Marijuana Policy. As Ashley and the Mayor already did, I'd like to welcome you to Denver as well. Again, I apologize about the rain, but we're looking forward to learning and discovering with all of you the next couple of days. And I'm excited this morning to grill these guests that have joined us. So Eduardo has already introduced himself, but I'll let Jesse and Josh introduce themselves as well.
I already know Jesse.
Hi, my name is Jesse Todris. I'm legal counsel to the Ontario Legalization of Cannabis Secretariat. If you want a shorter version of that title, it's, for lack of a better word, I'm Ontario's pot lawyer. I've been involved in the development of Ontario's legalization and regulation scheme for the last 3 years, and have been working with my executive director, Renu Kalendran, who sends her regrets and wish she could be here, to both address sort of the emerging issues vis-a-vis legalization, as well as the next wave of issues that Canada's currently experiencing, and then I'm happy to talk about on the panel today. Thanks.
Good morning. My name is Joshua Claymeyer. I'm the president of my own consultancy called Green Compass Group. My background is having worked with think tanks most of my life, research policy and nation building. So my last stint was at the Rand Corporation when they were advising Washington State on their policy. And unfortunately, the ivory tower won that fight, and Washington had some really big problems they had to fix. So it's really important to look at the consultants in this group as true kind of resources of information and analysis, because we are still in a world of qualitative versus quantitative statistics when it comes to this industry. And we need to move from qualitative to quantitative. So.
All right. So we're going to try to touch on the different models that each of these countries have looked at and have implemented. So Josh, the first question for you is, you have a lot of experience and knowledge in international cannabis and the different frameworks. So can you just kind of walk through what some of the differences are that you see between a public model like you would find in Uruguay versus a private model like you would find here in the United States?
Sure. I'm originally from Cali, Colombia, so I have an interesting view on Central and South America. And it really is one that focuses on the middle class, the building of the middle class. So the public policy structure of Uruguay was basically brought into effect to quell the black market. They had no interest in being in focusing on commerce. They were all about reducing the weight of the black market and the problems, and this is the same in Colombia as well, and Mexico. So we have a real opportunity to look at America and Canada as being leaders in creating the structure and testing that structure, something that Latin America can't do. Between the corruption and the lack of education and perhaps a lack of community and the lack of activists, they rely on the North to kind of knock off the edges. And so if we can pull our policies together, then Latin America becomes an instant beneficiary of that. And when we look at the war on drugs and violence, it really comes down to politicians and bad science. The proletariat will always be there, and they will always need to work, and they will always have health issues and education issues. So we have a real opportunity here to look at this model as something that's not just for us, not just to clean up the past 80, but really as inspiration for the next 100 for everybody below the equator.
Eduardo, anything you want to add to that?
Well, first of all, I want to say that until yesterday, I had my presentation perfect, but yesterday was a new bill president in the Mexican Congress that changed drastically the model that Mexico will be having. In June 2017, Mexico approved the medical marijuana and the CBD under 1%. In November 2018, we have a secondary law that regulates and has similar protocols that you have here in the United States and regarding the tracking, destruction, etc. But in February 2019, the Supreme Court approved the personal use of cannabis, even for recreational. But in March 2019, now that this new government took office, they revoked the secondary law and actually the permits. They gave permits to 7 companies for 38 different products of CBD, and they revoked that. And yesterday, a new bill was presented in the Congress by the leader of the majority of the Morena party, that is the leading. And right now we have a hybrid system that I will discuss with you a little bit later, but it's a hybrid between a public and private system that includes a monopoly from the government in the purchase and in some way the production, and has a very, very big differences with the other models. I think that is exciting, but is just brand new yesterday.
So, as experienced here in Denver, I think one thing I can say is that get used to that. Things change pretty quickly. Yeah. So we always used to say we were building the fire truck on the way to the fire, and so being able to react and pivot pretty quickly and learn what's happening. So glad to see we're not the only ones. So then Jesse, why don't we have a question for you? So what are some of the positive and negative effects of having cannabis legalized at the federal level in Canada compared to, in the United States where it's a state-by-state regulation? And then if you could just walk us through maybe you have the federal regulations, but then what decisions are left to the provinces to make?
Sure, and just to maybe tie into the last one in terms of the need as a regulator to be flexible, and this, I think, a little bit informs the experience that Ontario's had today. So at a broad level, production and cultivation is regulated at the federal level. So the federal government introduced a bill in 2017 legalizing the cultivation, the production, and the distribution of cannabis at a federal level, and ultimately left retail and distribution to provinces to sort out. So as a result, what we have is producers being regulated by Health Canada as the primary regulator, and then each province has their own retail and distribution system. What you see is a spectrum. So there are some that are entirely public models, where usually, a number of provinces have sort of liquor monopolies within their jurisdiction that sell liquor. In Ontario, it's the Liquor Control Board of Ontario, that are crown agencies. A number of those have expanded their mandate to sell cannabis. Some have proposed public models that have also elements for the private sector. So, for example, British Columbia has both government agency-run stores as well as private retails operating in two parallel systems. Other jurisdictions, like Saskatchewan, have gone for an entirely private model, whereby the entire retail, including wholesale, is entirely run by the private sector. There are other variations of private sector models within Canada where, essentially similar to sort of what my colleague was talking about here, there is a government retailer and distributor that is providing exclusive wholesale function to private retailers. Ontario, and I'll get into the merits here, in the 3 or 4 years that I've been working on cannabis policy, has essentially drafted legislation for every single one of these permutations. And as a result, I think I'm going a little bit prematurely gray. But when we first, the previous government, led by Kathleen Wynne, had wanted a public model. We had a provincial election in June 2018. We pivoted to a private retail model under a new government. Now, in December 2018, it was found that there was sort of a lack of supply. So notwithstanding, there was yet another pivot to allocate licenses. In terms of the benefits, I think one of the things that's really good about it is it results in having a spectrum of different approaches to the same public policy objectives. Some provinces have chosen to do this through private, through retail. All of these different considerations can happen with a level of consistency built in with a national framework. We have some of the same, all of the major rules in terms of public possession, the ability to cultivate within your home, distribution, sale are nationally consistent no matter where you are in the country. However, they left a great deal of room to provinces to customize an approach. So for example, in Ontario, where I'm from, the minimum age is 19. In our neighboring provinces of Manitoba, it would be 18. So you're able to sort of make what is appropriate for an individual province in terms of those public policy decisions. We've also had the benefit of national public awareness and education campaigns, and the fact that you're able to drive that and sort of build a bit of an economies of scale by having similar shared public policy objectives nationally. It has prevented an exacerbation of the illegal market. So what we don't have is concerns with a state-by-state approach where a state that's legal bordering a non-legal state and concerned about diversion. We're not worried about sort of provincial borders as much. There are certainly sort of trade and commerce-related borders, but it's not about the illegal market. I think the other thing, and I talked about this with some of the folks I was sitting with before, I think one of the biggest pieces is banking. It's legal, so you have a consistency. Banking institutions, we have 6 sort of primary nationally regulated banks within Canada. They all deal with marijuana. We don't have this concerns about a cash-related business. We don't, a number of the larger cultivators in the province are listed in our national stock exchange within the Toronto Stock Exchange, as well as a number of American entities that have also sought the ability to raise capital within a nationally regulated framework. In terms of the negatives, and I'll say this as a province, we didn't determine our timelines. The federal government indicated that cannabis shall be legal whether you want to or not on October 17th, 2018. And as a result, we had always been working towards a timeline that was being largely fulfilled by another level of government with limited policy choices in respect of how to vary from those dates. There are limits to the customization of those provincial frameworks. I'd talk about an ability to sort of tailor, but there are federal restrictions that make it very difficult to really get into specifics. A good example is in British Columbia, which has a long history of, let's say, legacy cannabis producers. They're having a great deal of time having some of those smaller producers transition into the legal market as a result of the costs. So in a situation where you can't build your own, cultivation system at a provincial level, there are some public policy objectives that are missed. And I think the other piece is, and one that we've been working on a lot, is that the federal framework doesn't leave any room for First Nations. First Nations have constitutional authorities within the Canadian constitutional framework, and there's essentially no clear room for First Nations within a retail and distribution framework. And as a result, provinces have had to sort of bridge that a little bit and start nation-to-nation conversations. But that's something that's very much ongoing.
Great. Thank you. So I'm just going to shift a little bit and ask you, Josh, what is your perception of how public support is trending for legalization? Kind of, you have the kind of global perspective. So what's your perception on how that's trending?
Well, that's a big one. I mean, we have a real problem here. I think a lot of the American populace, at least, are being educated by news reporters, and that is a terrible place to be. We have an alphabet soup of cannabinoids, and the only ones that we talk about are THC and CBD. Nobody talks about CBN, CBC, CBG. These are massively potent chemicals that are engineered for your body. You have this incredible symbiosis with them. So the public really, we need to perhaps focus more on educating in universities, educating in schools, educating in rest homes. It's a really important groups of people, demographics of people that if they're not getting the information, then they're definitely not accessing phase 3 tested medicine. You know, so you're not having the pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides, which are so critical. And now we have the vaping issue, which vitamin E, I believe, is in these fake pens, and then suddenly it turns into hydrochloric cyanide. So we have more than just an education problem here. We have a science problem, and we have a moral problem because people are still scared about searching. You know, they think one Google search is going to have the NSA on their doorstep. And this is 80 years of basically prohibition and fear. So we need to be the educators. We need to be the normalizers. We need to be the people with information at our fingertips that say, oh, wait, no, you're quite wrong. This is actually the science. Because America is a sum negative of science here. We actually, our FDA was set up in the 1960s and 70s to prove cannabis was bad for you, not a sum total of neutral or positive. So our education truly needs to focus on outside resources like Canada, like Israel, like Australia. And we need to get over this problem that cannabis is worse than alcohol. I mean, or cigarettes. That's flat out wrong. And so this is a true revolution for us to not only take hold of our information, but also take hold of our health.
So Eduardo, how about in Mexico? Is the public's support for legalization, is it trending towards legalization, and is that the drive for the possible change?
Sure. First of all, let me give you one brief overview about this new bill that was presented yesterday. It's federal, with access to the banking system, will allow the people to cultivate in their home until 6 plants for their self-consume without any kind of regulation. They are creating a national commission to regulate the cannabis that they will be in charge to give the licenses to plant and cultivate cannabis. And according with this bill, the 20% of the cultivation must to be in those counties that has been suffering for the crime of illegal commercial of drugs, and the other 20% must to be given in those counties that they have one of the poorest counties in indigenous background. Those licenses must to be given in most of the cases to cooperatives and small farmers, and they are creating an estate company that those cultivators only can sell their productions to that state company. And that the commission will give the licenses to the dispensaries, and they do not allow that integrate vertical companies. I mean, if you get a license for cultivation, you cannot get a license for a dispensary. And the dispensaries only can get the product from this state company, and is forbidden to get it from any other place. And they can decide the amount of the production that they can purchase, and also the cost. Actually, according to the bill, this company can regulate the price in order to target the illegal market. Also, every single product that is less than 2% of THC, 2%, is not regulated. That means that according to the Mexican agricultural laws right now, will be treated like a food supplement, or can be a cosmetic, but nothing related with cannabis. Now, regarding the public support, as you know, in Mexico we are having a huge problem, obviously, with the violence. We are neighbors of the largest market worldwide for illegal drugs. And everyone wants to cross through our country to sell the drugs here. So because that, right now we have a national security issue regarding the violence and the public safety. Right now in Mexico today, there are people murder or executed 80 people a day. So we cannot keep in handle that. So because obviously we know that we will be facing a huge problem of public safety. And in order to prevention campaigns, we do not have the infrastructure and the resources that you have here in US or in Canada, and we know that. But for us, right now, the prohibition is meaning people dying. So I think that right now in the country is an acceptation, not totally, but a majority acceptation of that solution, even with the problems that we will be facing and the challenges that we'll be facing.
Great, thank you. So Jesse, I guess back to you. When cannabis became legal in Denver, we didn't know what we didn't know. We were kind of, walking into it without a roadmap. Any lessons you were able to take away from the first couple of years of legalization within the United States, or within some states within the United States, and anything you were able to copy?
Yeah, for sure. I think having the benefit of having Colorado, Washington, a few of the other early states, I think provided a really good roadmap. I think both in terms of specific ways to operationalize legalization, as well as even just knowing what areas you need to do. I think one of the things in starting from the ground floor is, thinking from a public policy framework, what are the questions that we need to decide on? So, in terms of things like setting rules for minimum age, public possession, rules with respect to purchase and distribution, where you can consume, and then getting into those second waves. I think one of the things that we really benefited hearing from a number of folks in the room, people who had gone through their own early regulatory experiences, was the value in kind of going slow on a number of issues. This, oft-heard analogy about once toothpaste is out of the bottle, you can't really get it back in. One of the things that the federal government certainly heard from that was a desire to phase out the legalization of certain types of cannabis. So on October 17th last year, the only forms of cannabis to date that you can legally purchase are cannabis dry flower, certain types of oils, as well as sort of capsules. Specifically, a policy choice was made to not legalize the commercial manufacture and, as a result, the distribution of edibles, extracts, and topicals until the 1-year anniversary of coming into force of the act. So basically, they did the federal government did a consultation 3 or 4 months ago. We expect that edibles and those types of products will be sort of in the marketplace by the end of this year, early next year. There's a sort of a bit of a phased period. But that gave us a really good opportunity to do further consultation about those specific product types, and also to sort of build in a little bit of a concept of normalization of cannabis before we introduce these new product types. I think about edibles and a number of the concerns in terms of poison controls or other things we heard from regulators in the group. We were able to prevent those initially and really study and look at best practices and look at different state models for what edible regulation could look like. What constitutes appealing to children, what kind of guidance, what kind of product types. I think the other piece that I think was really critical in terms of intentional differences that Canada has set up is that ultimately Canadians are used to a high level of regulation, generally speaking, in terms of products. So I will say, and this is partially by design, but because we have a federal system, the licensing process in terms of having closed loops, because there's that level of consistency, you have, I think, benefits, which are a high level of regulation and centralization in terms of how product is flowing from the cultivator into the consumer. But at least for right now, because of that high level of regulatory cost, and also the fact that quite frankly, outdoor cultivation is not realistic for large parts of Canada. We're a pretty cold country. Costs are still fairly high, and that also impacts the ability to address the illegal market, at least initially. But the other thing that we heard, and I think we're starting to see from a number of folks in jurisdictions like Colorado and other ones, is that this undersupply from a legal perspective quickly shifts to an oversupply. And we're starting to get to that point now. So we're going to see those costs, but also understanding what are the policy drivers we need to consider in terms of ensuring that that sort of oversupply of legal cannabis doesn't get diverted to illegal sources. There's a couple of other lessons learned in terms of like understanding the national data framework. That was really important. I think that there's been a lot of really good work done within U.S. jurisdictions about seed to sale, and I think our federal colleagues learned a lot about that. And generally also realizing, I think the point I often made when I was sort of giving these kinds of speeches before legalization was I was able to point to jurisdictions where, for lack of a better word, the sky didn't fall on legalization. That there are large, sophisticated U.S. states that have legalized cannabis without necessarily usage rates going way up, or cannabis being smelled in the streets wherever you go, or houses blowing up from making shatter within with a residential building. So it was able to show, give a realistic picture of what the policy landscape would look like before legalization, which I think was really important to getting that broader acceptance.
So Josh, any thoughts from you around lessons that other countries are able to take away from either things they should or should not be doing?
Yeah, I think that there's a pretty clear roadmap as to all the mistakes that we've made here in the United States and in Canada. I think that the best thing that they can do is look at the lessons that we've learned. This is exceptional news that below 2% THC is not going to be regulated. This is fantastic. This also originated in Uruguay. Uruguay was the first nation to up the 0.3% THC level that was brought into effect in 1961 to 1% THC, which gives you an entirely different genotype and phenotype of what you're growing. We are now going to be in the world of what's called medicinal hemp. And I believe the rest of the world is learning that. And these Canadian companies like Afria and Canopy Growth, they have now major operations in Kazakhstan, growing hundreds of acres of hemp so that they can extract these cannabinoids. And it's not industrial hemp, but it can also be used industrially because this plant has multiple uses. It's not just an orange, or an apple. You can grow bioplastiques on the roots. You can take the bast from the inside of the bark and turn it into graphene. There are phenomenal opportunities, and the cannabis side is just a portion of it. So it's really important to get this out front because it is the most concerning thing to deal with. But economically and socially and on the public level, we have to understand this is a revolution of an industry that has been outside of the last 80 years of industrial achievements. So we have this tremendous cross-pollination happening here. And if there's one thing that the rest of the world can take a note from, is seeing that and jumping in on that. Because it's not just about trying to smoke a joint. This is about trying to get very high quality product to market in the right places. And I think that the rest of the world understands capitalism very well in that level. So let's get to it.
Right. So Eduardo, I think you touched on it a little bit, but can you just maybe elaborate a little bit more? It sounds like Mexico believes that legalizing will help with the underground black market. So can you just touch on that a little bit and some strategies around that?
Yeah, sure. Right now, we are having the worst scenario. The worst scenario that you can have is in some hand legalized and in the other one criminalized. So that is the worst scenario. You can criminalize it or you can legalize it, but you cannot have both. And right now, we're seeing the worst scenario for us. I think that according with this bill and the way that it's presented, trying to have some impact, specifically because it's mandatory that at least the 20% of the plantations and cultivation must to go in those counties that the violence is worse and in the main production areas currently for the cartels. And once that we have the legalization, at least for the cannabis, looks like, yes, it's going to help to decrease the levels of violence. It's going to help also to involve many people that right now they don't have any choice, and they whether they want or not, they have been kidnapped or pushed by the criminals to work in this, to have an alternative. Obviously, it's not going to end the illegal market of other drugs and the production of other substances that mainly are exported from Mexico, but probably will help. As I said, we will be facing a huge challenge regarding health policies and prevention campaigns, and also we have been seeing how the consumption has been increasing in the country. But right now we don't have many choices. I think that this can have an important impact in the black market, and also because according with this model, this new company that will be owned by government can subsidize the cost in order to frontally impact the market and go against the illegal market. So they can even decide to reduce just the cost of the legal cannabis to attack frontally the illegal market. So that looks like it will have an impact. Hopefully, but looks like it's going to happen that many of those persons that right now are in the legal part, probably they were looking for do the business legally. So at least they will be under the system. We'll see. But if you think that enforce the regulations here is complicated, wait for Mexico. So let me tell you something. Mexico has the second largest diversity of ethnic groups worldwide. We have 57 different ethnic groups, 53. China had 63. And in Mexico today they speak, 57 and 67. In Mexico today they speak 53 different languages, tongues, and dialects among 63 different ethnic groups. François Mitterrand, the former president of France, he said once, how can you govern a country that made more than 500 different kinds of cheese? Well, how can you govern a country that made more than 5,000 kinds of tamales? So it's very complicated, and at a federal level, because it's not only about the diversity of the country, it's about also the background, and also about that in some parts of the country, they really do not share our Western point of view of the life. I will give you just one example. In some parts of Mexico, in rural areas, indigenous background, for example, it's normal, it's not only normal, it's usual and good that if you are in your 20s, you can be dating a girl that she's 15 years old. In Mexico, it's also a crime, okay? But the point is, when you go to those villages and say, hey, you cannot do that, they say, why not? My parents did. My grandparents did, my grandparents did. We have been doing this for thousands of years, and now you come here to tell me that it's a crime? Are you telling me that my parents are criminals? It's very complicated because they do not share this Western point of view of the rest of the society. That's why in some cases, in some areas of Mexico, because medicinal, traditional, or indigenous backgrounds uses, they used to use not only cannabis, other plants that they have been using for thousands of years in a different way that we try to regulate it here. So that is the challenge. I think that this is very challenging, and is very and will be the main goal of the authorities to see how enforce this and try to everybody go together in the legislation and in the legality, and at the same time hitting the illegal market and trying to decrease the violence that we are having right now in the country related to drug trafficking.
Great. So I was going to hold this question for a little bit, but I think given what you just said, I think I'll ask it now. So are any of your, so this goes to all three of you, any of your governments concerned about diversity or equitable access into the industry? And if so, are there any programs being developed around that? Sure.
I think there certainly is a concern for social equity, both in terms of ensuring those, I think one of the aspects that's unfortunate that we share with the United States is that the people that suffered the worst from the criminalization of cannabis were disproportionately people of color, racialized people, indigenous people. And similarly, what we're experiencing now a year and a half in is that the companies that are profiting from legalization tend to not be diverse and to not tend to be represented from those particular groups. So there's a couple things Ontario specifically has done. One is that we're currently working through a limited allocation system with respect to retail licenses in Ontario. And we've set aside specific First Nations licenses. So approximately 10% of the licenses that are issued right now or could be issued are set aside for those that are operating on First Nations reserves, analogous to an American Indian reservation. Another thing that we thought was really important from a retail perspective is we recognized, again, as a result of that over-criminalization, that there was a need to ensure that those individuals who had experience and perhaps had adverse consequences when cannabis was illegal still had opportunities within the legal market. So as a result, the Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario, who's the provincial regulator for cannabis licensing, has certain criteria that they consider when faced with an application for a retail license. And generally, the threshold characteristic is whether or not someone has honesty and integrity. And there are a number of things within the Cannabis License Act that establish sort of how the registrar of the AGCO should be considering that. And one of the things that we thought was very important from a public policy perspective was stating that having a conviction under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, which is the act that, similar to sort of federal legislation here, that previously criminalized cannabis. What we said is having a conviction or a charge for selling cannabis, for trafficking cannabis, for growing cannabis was not a bar to you having a retail license. And so we specifically clarified that. We wanted to give folks opportunities to transition into this legal market. The second piece that I just highlight here is that Ontario has basically said that individuals under the age of 19, which is our minimum age, can't possess any cannabis. We've made it a provincial offense with a very minor ticket. But what we've encouraged, rather, recognizing that, again, individuals that are most likely to get targeted by this use possession prohibition are likely to be, Black, people of color, Indigenous people within the province, that we've created a diversion program whereby instead of being charged, they can go through a approved youth education program with a view to trying to keep folks out of the system from the entire thing. I think social equity is a really important lens, one that also needs to be assessed sort of by our federal counterparts with respect to the cultivation, but one that we're certainly doing a lot of data collection to monitor and to continue to work on.
Well, in the case of Mexico, we will have to wait a little bit to see how this bill ends finally in the Congress and the secondary laws. But at least in the cultivation part, looks like they are precisely targeting and taking care about this kind of equity and trying to give some advantages for the small farmers, for the indigenous backgrounds and for the small village. We don't know yet the criteria to give the dispensaries licenses, but looks like it will not be too much. Actually, this bill says that the county authorities must give permission to have a dispensary in the county. If they don't give the permission, then the state government must come at least one dispensary per state in the capital of that state. So looks like they will be putting a very high entry barriers for the players in the game, but looks like yes, they are trying to have that equity. And just a few weeks ago, the current president of Mexico, he gave an executive order to release every single person that has been detained by possession of an amount of any kind of drug can be considered self-consumed. So every single person that is right now in jail will be released if they were arrested for carrying an amount that can be considered for just self-consumption. So looks like they are trying to have some policies here, but as I said, because it's very brand new, we'll have to wait how finally the law is approved and how the secondary law is regulated.
I'd say that social equity is definitely at the core of the public policy debate. We're not going to have a market unless we have social equity. And there's something really critical, and I think it's maybe somewhat simple to say, but it's really, really important to keep this in mind, that without growing cannabis or hemp, we don't have a market or an industry. So this is truly, first and foremost, an agricultural step forward. And who are the agriculturists? Who are the farmers? The people who need the social equity the most. Not the big businesses who are coming in. And this has happened a few times in Colombia, where we have large companies come in, a few Canadian actually, and they grow amazing cannabis companies, but they have no idea how to grow cannabis. And so those companies are failing. And there's a massive opening here that is actually being taken advantage. I'm aware of at least 2 funds in Latin America that are focusing on hemp and cannabis, and they're doing microloans. And they're opening up businesses so that they can follow the kind of sociological, anthropological Peace Corps movement that has been going down to Central America and South America from the US since, I think, the mid-'70s when the Peace Corps started. The point is that the farmers, the lay people, are absolutely critical to this industry, and they are being ignored. And they're being ignored on both the amount of backlash that they have received because of the amount of blacks and Latinos in jail, and it happens state by state, country by country. And these people don't have opportunities to educate themselves to get master's degrees, so they stay in their local areas with their local communities. And if we don't have a community-focused public policy, then we will never have social equity, and this market will fall apart. So it's really critical. That's my 2 points.
Great, thank you for those thoughts. So I'll backtrack just a minute, and then we'll have just one more question after this one. So Jesse, back to you. So you're 1 year in, a little bit more. So what are some big surprises that you've seen so far? Anything you expect, anything you didn't expect, any data around crime or health, youth usage or anything like that that you were surprised by?
So a couple things. I mean, one of the things that we were surprised by is we dealt with a little bit of difficulties, at least out of the gate, in terms of distribution. So Canada has had a medical cannabis system in various levels since 2001. In 2015, it was moved to a model where it was companies that was producing it. They were distributing it to individuals via the mail. Those same companies were sort of grandfathered in to be the first wave of cultivators and producers under the Canadian system. And on October 17th, gates were open and there wasn't enough cannabis for the country. And part of it was a distribution issue, understanding new packaging and labeling requirements, but also it was a new business. You could be a great business, you could grow the best cannabis in the world, that doesn't mean you're a good distribution company. So Ontario in particular struggled with concerns about there just not being enough cannabis, and as a result, we had to make some pivots within our retail model to limit the number of licensed stores. Our original intention was the only limit to the number of stores will be market demand. And we had to cap the number of licenses because having hundreds or thousands of cannabis stores that were sitting empty was considered a real concern, both in terms of the private investment associated with going through the retail licensing process, but also concerns about, well, if they don't have any cannabis, what are they going to do within that store? Are they going to start to source cannabis from the illegal market? In terms of the data and indicators, a couple things I wanted to share that I think are interesting. So prior to legalization, 14% of Canadians reported over the age of 18 were self-reported as using cannabis. As of the first quarter of 2019, that number is 18%, which is actually a pretty significant uptake. I think what's interesting is the majority of those new users are first-time users between the ages of 45 and 64. So it's interesting in terms of those people that are getting into or getting back into the cannabis market space. I think it does also have an interesting indicator for the types of products that may be interested. I think no one in Canada, at least at the retail level, predicted how popular CBD was going to be. And, both in terms of flower or oils or other kinds of products, in the initial days of legalization, stores could not keep these products on the shelves. What we're seeing is producers sort of shifting as a result of sort of a lot of global interest in CBD, and I think stuff that's also been sparked by the Farm Bill here. But certainly what we're seeing is industry catching up to that, and as we get towards topicals, edibles, and extracts, I think we're going to see a large wave of CBD products. I should also note that the federal government's currently doing a consultation as to sort of considering deregulating or otherwise treating CBD only, or under a certain threshold of THC. Currently, our threshold is 0.3, similar to the U.S. system, as to what that future state looks like. In terms of consumer behavior, I think a positive sort of trend is that 47% of cannabis users reported obtaining their cannabis from a legal source. That is an increase from 23% in 2018. So in 1 year of legalization, to be able to capture potentially up to a quarter of the illegal market was a really positive and I think unexpected step. I think what we recognize is it's a very entrenched legacy illegal market with billions of dollars. They're not going out of this business willingly, but the fact is that folks are showing an interest in legal regulated product. I think the other piece that I think was, again, a positive surprise is there was virtually no change in the number of individuals who both reported using cannabis within 2 hours of driving a motor vehicle, as well as the number of impaired drug charges. And this is something, again, where talking to U.S. jurisdictions that looked at some of this data, I think when looked at it at a macro scale, I think we were able to provide some comfort. I recognize that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done on the science side with respect to impairment and THC, and what's the equivalent of a 0.05 or a 0.08, and having OFSDs, oral fluid screening devices, that are readily available for police to use. But that being said, from a societal perspective, it doesn't look like trends with respect to impaired driving are going up. And I think the future state goal is obviously for that number to keep going down as these things, and folks, I think we've experienced that with respect to alcohol, and the hope is that that will also go that way with respect to cannabis. And again, I think the last piece is just, I remember going to conferences like this in 2016 where I was just seeing PowerPoints about explosions and all of these worst case scenarios that were going to happen and that were to be commonplace with respect to cannabis, and we just haven't seen that. And that's something that's sort of a testament to, I think, effective public education from both levels of government, but also just society being ready for this kind of fundamental change.
Great. All right, so I'll throw one last question out to the three of you, and then you all get your questions ready. We'll have a little time for you to ask some questions as well. So just broad, basic question, what do you guys see as the next steps and challenges for legalized cannabis, I guess in Canada and Mexico and globally?
Well, I think that the main challenges that we'll have, obviously the first one will be how to enforce this new legislation. So that will be the major challenge for sure. But also we will be facing other ones. How can we really will be able to keep safe our children? How can we be able to do successful public policies for prevention and for health that we do not have the expertise and the resources that our neighbors have? So that will be kind of complicated and challenging, but I'm confident that we will find out how to do it. I think that Mexico right now is taking a path that is creating this hybrid model between the private and public partnership that it doesn't exist until I know in any other part. Uruguay is totally public, and the system that you have in US Canada is mainly private or free market. I mean, some regulations, but in this hybrid, I think that can be like a new experiment, but in my opinion, those are the big challenges. And also learning from the experience from other places. I know, for example, here in Denver that you are still dealing with issues regarding teenagers and the schools, and also issues regarding pregnant women and situations like that. So hopefully the Mexican authorities will come and learn the experience from other places to know how to deal with those challenges and how to really be able to enforce the law. In my opinion, the main challenge will be that how to enforce that kind of law in a country like Mexico. That will be very complicated. But I think that those are the main challenges that we'll have.
For Canada and for Ontario specifically, I'd say that there's two primary regulatory challenges and things that are coming up. I've touched on both of them, which is Ontario transitioning back to an open allocation of license, having significantly more stores than they currently do, and where sort of the system where the market is the only limiter on the number of stores within the province. In terms of, the big change that's happening is in 2 weeks when edibles, extracts, and topicals come into the market, both in terms of what those products are, dealing with product expectation, and understanding how the federal government will be regulating the production, and provinces and territories the sort of sale and distribution of those. I think where where the province is looking at is now, I'd say we've kind of finished off the first wave of legalization, and now we're on to the second wave. And that second wave is both these new classes of product, but looking at new types of public policy issues. Ontario is looking towards, doing some policy work on a couple of key things: consumption establishments at a provincial level, secondary services like delivery services, enabling click and collect, and those kinds of things, special occasion permits. I think once you have broad access to retail and self-product, it's really understanding the dynamics of the marketplace and responding to those. So when I go on Google in Canada and I put in cannabis, I'm number 5 on that hit. But beyond that, you still see a number of illegal operators that are, operating, delivery services. There are still some illegal dispensaries in parts of Canada. And, to me, there's 2 aspects to that. There's the compliance and enforcement regime. We work very closely with our policing colleagues at the provincial and federal levels to kind of address these. But it's also a market-based solution. So we need to be looking as regulators as to, what services, is it price, is it quality, is it convenience that we're not missing, and continuing to address that from a policy framework to enable folks to be able to get those kinds of services they expect. If I can call, I'm a former patent lawyer and a trademark lawyer as well, so this bothers me from an intellectual property perspective, but there are services that exist, for example, in Canada called Duber or Weedora or other kinds of things that are offering same day, 30, 45-minute cannabis delivery. And until a legal market can provide that services, there's always going to be that gap. So we need to be looking at those services, but also considering them within the broader public health, protecting youth, all of these other considerations that a government has to do when they're doing those regulatory schemes to make sure that we have the next sort of wave of policy issues addressed as we're going forward on that. And I guess the last thing I would say that's really a priority, and in particular in the last couple of weeks, is vaping. I think with all of the stories that are coming out, my colleague here talked about the vitamin E solutions, and it's interesting timing for the province because you haven't actually been able to buy a vape cartridge legally in Canada yet, and won't for another up to 60, 70 days. So understanding what that looks like, what does that look like from a consumption perspective? What does that look like from a public policy perspective? What does that look like from a public information and awareness campaign perspective? So these are all things that, both Ontario and the rest of the jurisdictions will really have to look at over the next couple of years.
Well, I'd say that was pretty comprehensive. I don't have much to add. I mean, I think in Colombia and in Uruguay and in these southern countries, we have to keep in mind that they don't have the government reach and breadth that we do up north. So we have to be, fair, so to speak, in that they already have a market. So the question is, how do we transition the existing market into one that is profitable and healthy, that focuses on health and profit? And I was going to actually say intellectual property for Latin America is huge. I mean, this is going to be fundamental to them accessing the European market, the Australian market, the African market. It's not about Latin America producing, like they have been, drugs for America's hunger, but it's for them to actually industrialize and normalize. And that takes banking, and it takes governments that get ahead of the curve, because putting the toothpaste back in the bottle in Latin America is 10 times as hard.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I think we'll open it up to the audience for questions. I think there are a couple of microphones that are wandering around. There's one right there, so if you have a question, raise your hand, and I think they'll come to you. Oh, there's one over there.
Thank you. Testing. There we go. Thank you. Josh had brought up an interesting topic about the education, public education. From our firesides, we're firm believers in that. What do you think the best mechanism would be to get some of the information out there? And I don't know why we don't have technical reporting from the United States available, but what would be the best mechanism to get educational reports out there on the benefits of the numerous CBD-type chemicals in the plant?
Well, I have two initial ideas. One is for example, in the United States, the American Medical Association has to require doctors in their yearly necessity for repeat training and credits to have some kind of module on cannabinoids, which they currently do not. I believe CVS and Walgreens or something like that, they want to bring CBD into their businesses, and so they're making their pharmacists take those classes. But this is not a federal requirement. So this needs to be a federal requirement, that our doctors need to be educated. I educate my doctors. That's not the right position to be in. And these doctors are referencing science that was inappropriately brought up from 1961. So I think there's probably two things. One, we need to get our medical community somewhat on board, at least in the concept that CBD and the other cannabinoids that are not psychoactive actually have direct benefits. And the other thing is, as civilians, as people, part of this society, we have an obligation to educate ourselves and to stop the inappropriate conversations that are so lopsided. This is a statistic-based community we have here. I can tell you how many people die a day of cigarettes and alcohol. And how many people have died of cannabis? Anybody? 0. Ever. So the education here is really important to really infiltrate both our medical community and our families. That'd be my 2 minutes.
Please.
And I guess coming from a governmental perspective, I think it's a two-sided thing. I think, we're having similar conversations in terms of, physicians are regulated at a provincial level within Canada. The CPSO is the regulatory agency, and I think that there is certainly work that needs to be done on education for doctors and understanding that. And there's still within medical cannabis, which is still a federal program, the gateway and the gatekeepers to that are still physicians. So understanding that science is absolutely, I think, critical. I think the other thing in terms of the best practices for public information and awareness about CBD, I think it needs to be balanced. I think it needs to be studied. I think Canada has an actual really big opportunity here to become a world leader in terms of research, right? I think by virtue of the fact that there are federal research licenses, we don't have to deal with some of the state-to-state issues. There's an opportunity for large research institutions to become world leaders in this. That being said, I think the reason why we need to have good science is that on one hand, you have a body of information that's coming out that sort of is still from the Prohibition era that says, like the mayor talked about, concepts that this is a gateway drug or things like that. On the other hand, you also have, whether it be through social media or other means, CBD. I can't think of a medical condition that I haven't seen as CBD describing in terms of some of these publications, from cancer to HIV. And, we're talking about qualitative versus quantitative. Having good, double-blind, methodologically clear scientific data that's easily disseminated in channels that people actually use, I think is really the key. So it's about having that balance, but getting it out to individuals so that they can actually access it and know that it's the right kind of information.
Right. Oh, and when you're done, there's one right up front here, too. Okay, go ahead.
I've got a question concerning how the other countries have addressed national health care, and quite frankly, it's all about money reimbursement through treatment using cannabinoids. in this country, until the FDA approves it, SAMHSA can't allow us to use public funding using this substance for medical use. Has any of the other countries that you're aware of approved it and have significant data that we could piggyback off of to get a fast track on approval?
Maybe I can start with respect to the Canadian system. So similar to, currently cannabis, whether it contains only CBD or THC, is not treated different from a regulatory perspective. So a couple things with respect to sort of medical. So with respect to, we have a similar system in terms of if it does not have a DIN, if it doesn't have a drug information number, it's not eligible for certain kinds of reimbursement. So one of the things that I often hear when doing community engagement is there's a pretty, an advocacy happening to not tax medical cannabis, whether it be cannabinoid or CBD product only or having THC. So there's a federal excise tax that's exercised on the cultivation side that still applies to cannabis regardless of whether it's medical or recreational cannabis, and certainly a desire from a number of people within the medical community to get rid of that. I think the other piece is what we're looking at within this regulatory consultation that the federal government did before the election was looking at, what does this look like from a medical perspective if we were to deregulate CBD or treat it more like a natural health product as opposed to a controlled substance. I think the outcomes of our federal election, which is in 3 weeks, will be very instructive in that. But, for example, we have a number of unfortunate situations. So generally speaking, drug coverage is dealt with at the provincial level unless you're in a particular federal sector. So, for example, veterans can claim medical cannabis as an expense in Canada. First Nations and Indigenous Inuit people cannot. So generally speaking, their health drug coverage is generally covered by the federal government. So there are lingering policy issues, and I think the next government is going to really have to struggle and think about what the best way to treat those. Is it about deregulating the products and not treating them through the drug process? Or is it about, providing more coverage for medical processes? But certainly, I think advocates are going to not let that conversation not happen.
In the case of Mexico, I think that first of all, it is important to understand our health system. Is very, very complicated also, and very different than the system that you have here. Actually, we have 4 or 5 different health systems in the country. So if you work for a private sector and you have a formal job, you can apply for that we call the Social Security Institute, that your employer will pay 1/3, you will pay 1/3, and the government will pay 1/3 for your health system. If you work for the federal government, there's another institution that will take care of you. If you work for the Army or the Navy, there's another health institution that will help you. If you work for an state government, there's a different institutions, state level, that will take about your health. But if you do not work in a private sector, if you do not work in the federal government, or just if you have your own business, for example, or you don't have resources at all, you will be fit in another system we call popular insurance, that basically is a universal coverage that is for free. So if they're supposed to pay something if you can pay, but in the real basis, most of the people, they do not pay nothing at all. So it looks like how the model that they are describing for medical cannabis, this entity that will be a company owned by the federal government, they will be the only one allowed to supply the pharmaceuticals and labs in Mexico to provide and produce the medical marijuana products. And looks like probably, I will say that the 80% or 90% of those products will go through the public health system. That will mean that the government will pay for it and will give it to the people mostly for free. So it's not clear yet how the private sector will be having access to this, and how, for example, the drugstores or the pharmaceutical centers will have access for the general public. It's not clear yet. We will have to wait for the secondary laws. But looks like will be keeping this centralized and subsidized by the government. I think that will be kind of the model that we'll be having here. Right now, there's a few persons that they have some permits in Mexico for the Supreme Court that they can import legally some CBD or even cannabis products for medical purposes in Mexico, but it's just regarding a few persons that they got that order from the Supreme Court. Now, after this, we don't know also if it will be possible, for example, to import medical products from other countries. So looks like probably this state entity will be the only one that will be allowed to import those products and then distribute it in the country. So we are not sure. But regarding CBD products, as I said, less than 2%, everything will be unregulated. So looks like it will be very easy to import those products, produce them in the country, or even import the raw products in order to produce it and make those medical products in Mexico with CBD.
If you guys don't mind, go ahead and state your name and the organization you're affiliated with before asking a question.
My name's Jillian Schauer. I'm a public health consultant, and thank you guys for your presentations. So you've all been, and I'm building on the conversation you're currently having now with the last question. You all talked about moving CBD to an unregulated state. I think what you mean is moving it out of a controlled substance regulation, but I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about the regulatory framework that could still ensure that CBD products are safe, are free of contaminants. We know that these products can be mixed with thickeners and cutting agents that we need to be testing for. We also know that marketing claims can be problematic from a public health standpoint. So any comments on how your countries are thinking about that regulatory framework would be helpful.
Okay, well, in the case of Mexico, as I said, we will have to wait for the secondary laws, but looks like until this moment, any CBD product will have the treat as according with the current regulations from the Agriculture Department, the Mexican Agriculture Department, or for the Mexican FDA, that the name is COFEPRIS. Those institutions, they are the one in charge to review the quality of the products that they can fit the Mexican regulations regarding quality, health, labeling, etc. So, and according with this bill that, as I said, was presented just yesterday, looks like the only thing that they will be doing is testing if there is under the 2% of THC in order to allow it. And then will be, that is from the cannabis point of view. And after they tested that is under 2%, the rest of the game is in the field of the other institutions from the government that will be treating this product as any other product, as a food supplement, cosmetic, etc. So these also open other possibilities even for opportunities and business in Mexico. For example, here, until I know, if one crop or plantation is over 0.3%, must be destroyed. So I think that will be interesting to think in the possibility to adequate your regulations in order to allow to export that product, for example, to Mexico. We will be able to process it and to use it legally speaking as a CBD and can be a win-win situation for both. So I think that opened different alternatives and opportunities, at least in the case of Mexico.
Well, let me just say briefly, as far as Colombia and a lot of the second and third world countries, we're woefully inadequate in this industry and that level. But then again, you can look at the United States and say, well, every state's an island, and how well are we doing here? I believe Canada is the forefront of this. They have a unified front, and they have an opportunity to set the pace and set the tone. And that is already trickling down. So I think, once again, if we get our first world countries to understand these things and to figure them out, then the businesses will follow these practices, and they will trickle down to Latin America that way.
Thanks for clarifying in terms of the difference. Just for clarity, so again, just to reiterate where Canada is at right now, CBD, regardless of, there's sort of two streams, right? Is the first stream is that prior to the legalization of cannabis, there was an exemption, exempting regulation under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act called the Industrial Hemp Regulations, which enabled the production of industrial hemp. When cannabis was legalized, all forms of cannabis, regardless of CBD, THC, are treated as cannabis and are regulated as such. So producing cannabis oil that's primarily CBD is subject to the same product testing, labeling, additive requirements that any other form of cannabis is. And certainly I don't suspect that that's going to go away in terms of whatever that model looks for, perhaps more liberalized distribution or other kinds of things. In terms of, again, in a couple of weeks when CBD gummies will be legally available in Canada, they'll be subject to the same kinds of labeling, additions, what edibles can contain is very highly specified within the cannabis regulations, which are going to be coming into force. But in terms of what additives, how much packaging and labeling requirements, how much you can have per serving, how much you can have in an individual package within a broader package, it'll have to have the common THC stamp. It'll have to have other public information and awareness. So it will, as of right now, absent any kind of change, it'll remain highly regulated in the way that any other form of product will be. I think where it may be a little bit different is when we're looking at sort of hemp-based wellness products or these other sort of second or tertiary wave products. But at this time, I don't think there's any necessary plans to do that. It's just more about learning about what the concerns are, what are the considerations. Is there a different risk profile that you would take as a regulator to these types of products versus other ones that contain THC or THCA or other kinds of cannabinoids?
Good morning. My name is Henny Lastly. I run an organization called Smart Colorado. We look out to protect kids in the public space since we've legalized and commercialized recreational marijuana. And I appreciated your comment about youth. I believe you said youth use rates, and rates have stayed relatively stable. I wanted to bring to your attention that in our state, we've seen a statistically significant increase in dabbing, high concentrate waxes, but also in edibles. And I'm curious how you intend to get ahead of that as opposed to trying to chase it.
I'll just interrupt quickly, but throw your hand up if you have another question and we'll get the microphone over towards you, but go ahead.
So in terms of Canada, speaking to their experience, I mean, I think because of those sorts of, that was part of the reason why concentrates weren't legalized out of the bat. And I think that there was consideration that high potency products, shatter, dabs, et cetera, have significantly more potential for public health impacts, and in particular that those products tend to proliferate primarily amongst youth. So I think that there was concerns both, allowing these products right out the gate and also wanting to let the science catch up a little bit. Where I understand from a regulatory perspective, additives, the kinds of things that can be used within those products are going to be regulated at the federal level. So, for example, no butane, no alcohol, et cetera, can be used in the production of them. I think part of the product is the consideration is if you are going to have extracts which exist in the illegal market, they should be regulated and they should be, non-adulterated and contain those kinds of things. We've also done a lot of work with respect to youth possession and youth public information and awareness generally, and that has to do with modalities that, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, which is a sort of a very well-respected sort of public health institution, as well as mental health and addiction facility within Toronto, where I'm from, has put out what's called the Safer Use Canada, the Cannabis Safer Use Guidelines, which is sort of 10 public health guidelines, many of which are primarily addressed to youth, and I can sort of share through sort of the conference organizers. And it talks specifically about concerns with respect to dabbing and those kinds of things, but it's about targeting youth primarily through the public information and awareness channels. Ontario is currently in a second phase of a public health and information and awareness campaign that is almost exclusively being targeted towards social media and is really trying to engage children. But I think it's an ongoing concern, right? Is how do you make sure that you are getting the right kinds of information out, that you're making sure that's being realized, but that if there is product that is being available, it's being done through the legal channels.
We had two questions over here.
Hi. Is this work? Hi, my name is Bia Campo, I work for the City of Denver. My question is for Jesse and Eduardo. To touch on a couple of things that you said, Jesse, you said that mostly of the growth in Canada is done indoors. And Eduardo, you said that for decades, the Central Latin America in general has been the primary point of growth of drugs throughout the world. So I guess my question is, as we become a more internationalized market and as other nations legalized, how do you see this impacting the Canadian market? And do you think there will be a point where we'll just have like free trade of cannabis products? And how do you see that impacting Canadian and Mexican companies?
That's a really good, that's a very good question. So currently under the regulatory framework, import of cannabis is only permitted under a couple of conditions. One, it either needs to be for medical or research purposes. It can't be for the recreational market. In addition, a license, an authorization needs to be granted both by the exporting country as well as the importing country. So if a Colombian company or a Canadian company based in Colombia wanted to export cannabis into the Canadian market, one, they would need to have authorization from the relevant Colombian authorities, and pardon me for not knowing if that includes state and federal, but it would be ultimately, I think federal is absolutely important. I think there's a question as to whether or not a subnational level of government is required as well. It also would need to receive an import permit from Health Canada and could only be used for medical cannabis. Certainly, I'm aware of a couple companies, I actually think primarily Colombian companies, that have imported cannabis into Canada for medical purposes. And similarly, there are a number of Canadian companies that have exported to European marketplaces, I think of Germany, for, again, medical purposes. So I think my own perspective, I'm going to give my, notwithstanding the fact that I'm a lawyer, this isn't legal advice, I think where the trend will likely go is there may be more of a free trade with respect to cannabis specific to medical purposes until there's a large shift of G7, G20 governments on the recreational side. I don't see that happening. I think if this country were to legalize it at a recreational level, that would change a lot of things. But in terms of where the current context is at, it does seem like with international drug treaties and compliance, and that's something that Canada specifically looked at. When the bill was going through the Senate subcommittee process, so we have a bicameral legislature, we have a federal parliament as well as a appointed Senate that has to review every bill. And when they were reviewing the cannabis bill, Bill C-45, there was a number of concerns, and ones I've also heard from other developing countries when we've met with them, about concerns with respect to noncompliance with international drug treaties. So to have a free trade of cannabis at a supranational level, to me, doesn't seem likely until a bit of a domino sort of momentum happens. Where I do see there a potential for trade is with respect to medical cannabis, and whether that be primarily CBD products or oils or other kinds of things. But I think what I've heard certainly sort of in pitches from countries that are seeking to import into Canada, it doesn't make a ton of sense. I alluded to this earlier. Canada's a very cold country. It doesn't necessarily make sense for a primarily agricultural product to be produced through hydroponic lighting at a very high energy cost. Leaving aside the regulatory scheme, if you were to just look at it from a comparative advantage, a jurisdiction like Colombia can grow cannabis for pennies on the dollar compared to a Canadian company. So, I think in a future state where things may be more deregulated, we may see some trends in that regard. But until the drug treaties are there, until this country remains not legalized on a federal level, I think you'll see sort of a bit more of a piecemeal approach with respect to the global trade of cannabis.
In the case of Mexico, it's not clear yet how exactly is going to end this. Something that is clear is we can be one of the largest producers of marijuana worldwide, just because the climate, the orography, obviously will be much more cheaper than Canada or many other countries. But until this moment, looks like this public monopoly will be the only one to allow to produce for internal use. We don't see yet, could be, but it's not in the bill yet, how they can regulate the exports and imports. The way that I think that will be impacting the other markets is for the possibility or not to access to the Mexican market. And the Mexican market will be huge. We're 138 million people. There is more than 45 million that they can easily afford any of those products. That is more than the population of Canada. To give you an idea how huge is the trade with Mexico right now. Last year, Mexico bought American products for $296 billion. That was more than Spain, France, UK, Italy, Germany, Sweden, Netherlands combined. We purchase more American products than Japan, Australia, and China combined. We are the second largest trade partner of this country, just behind Canada, and just because they purchase more energy and oil. But besides that, we are so far the largest market for American products. So if they open that market to import products, will be huge and tremendous opportunity for many other companies worldwide. But we don't know if they will do it. We know for sure that they will be doing for CBD. And I'm pretty sure that will be probably the largest market worldwide for CBD products so far. In my opinion, will be as big as California or probably even larger. But regarding THC and cannabis products is not clear, and the production of the plant is not clear yet if they will be allowed the import or the export. Probably this Mexican entity can decide to export the product, and if that is the case, yes, will be affecting the other markets because even without any kind of dumping, obviously just in the regular basis, the cost will be a fraction of the cost to do it in other places. So, but it's not clear. We'll have to wait until the secondary laws and see how it is developing. Mm-hmm.
All right, and we have time for one last question here.
Hi, my name is Michelle Sokolowski. I'm with the City of San Diego. And there was a quick mention of a cap in Canada. And I'm wondering if you can expand on your experiences with that and if are there caps in Mexico or internationally? It's a big issue for us.
Yes, so what I was referring to is there's a cap of the number of retail stores in Ontario. So going back to first principles, each province has their own sort of retail distribution scheme. A number of stores have caps, a number of provinces have caps, Saskatchewan, Ontario. The public models tend to not have caps, they just won't build another store. I can speak to Ontario's experience, and again with the caveat that we did not intend to bring in a cap. So we introduced legislation in September of 2018, and in October 17, cannabis became legal. The only places that you could get it legally in Ontario at the time was online through the provincially run Ontario Cannabis Store website, and there was a view to enabling stores for April 1. By the time we were sort of moving towards opening up the application system, it was clear that there was not enough cannabis to have an open allocation system. So what happened was a lottery. Basically, the only requirements to enter into the lottery were you paid $75, you had to put your name, and you had to put your address. As a result, we had 16,000 applicants within the Ontario Retail Lottery with a total of 71,000 entries for 25 retail store licenses within 5 regions of a province. Because it was very low barriers of entry, I would say there was a wide spectrum of readiness between those 16,000 applicants. And as a result, there was a lot of third-party agreements once those individuals were selected. A couple of months ago, Ontario introduced a second pre-qualification lottery, and ideally the last one, where we tried to have some lessons learned from that retail system. And currently, so that was another 42 licenses, with 8 being set aside for First Nations. There were pre-qualification requirements. You needed to have letters from a bank saying that you had assets equivalent to about $250,000 Canadian, as well as access to a retail store space. Currently, that process is being challenged within the court, so I can't really talk further about that. But what I will generally say is if you are going to cap licenses, there's a couple of considerations you should take into account. One of which is, is it a regional methodology? We have setback requirements only in terms of schools, but it's understanding the kind of location-sensitive use pieces. But it's also ultimately what's the fundamental consideration for the method by which you select. So Ontario's policy choice was about, equitable distribution in the sense that no one person had any other chance. Other jurisdictions, like for example Manitoba, which is our neighboring province to the west, did a request for proposals process where they sort of did it like RFP. There were points awarded. There was returning back to the social equity piece. If you had active economic participation by First Nations, that was awarded certain points, retail experience. So there are differing considerations, but one of the things that Ontario has really affirmed recently through all this process is that we want to be getting out of the capping business and allow, individuals and the market to really dictate this, because ultimately you end up having to grapple with policy choices that can be unforeseen.
All right. Oh, go ahead.
So sorry. I think that will be. It's too soon to be sure, but looks like will be very high entry barriers. Very high entry barriers, and also low economical incentives, because the model that they are planning is a state is controlled by the government, and then they will give the franchises for these licenses, and they will control the amount of production that they can purchase from you, even if you have some exceeds in your production. They have the freedom to purchase or not. They will decide the cost of the production and the cost of the sale. So looks like will be very few players here, and it's not clear exactly which one will be there. So, but it's complicated to navigate the Mexican system, trust me. So I was in the government for 20 years, and right now I am the consultant part. So, and I know the monster from inside. But in this case, we will have to wait to see exactly how they do it, but it looks like the entry barriers will be very high. So if any of you have any question or issue regarding Mexico, I will be here around, and also my partner, Dimitri, so we will be here to help you in any other question regarding Mexico.
Okay. We are out of time, so I'm going to break here. I think we have a half-hour break until we're back in this room at 10:45, 15 minutes. 10:30-ish. And then, but join me in thanking our panelists.